Okay, so we're in this new series on Jesus. No, not yet. Only because there's one paragraph that I don't want you to see until we get there. Oh dear. So just obviously because Pat wasn't here last week as well. But I've made the decision that I want us to concentrate on Jesus right through the Bible, from Genesis to Revelation. And one of the reasons for that is I think the church down the last few decades has got more and more focused on us rather than on him. So much of the preaching is about how do we live our life? What does he give? What does he give us? And I think we just need to focus on who Jesus actually is, because he's at the heart of our faith. Mike made it very clear on that last message that he did. The test between whether it's a false prophet, false spirit, or a true spirit is whether it professes Jesus. There's no way to the Father but through Jesus Christ. So we're going to focus in on Jesus. And we talked quite a bit last week about how he is there from Genesis through to Revelation. And that what we're going to look at is, we're focusing on the Old Testament initially, to look at him through the whole of the Old Testament. And what we realised last week, and just as a recap for all of us, is that we see in the Old Testament that Jesus is sometimes patterned. So what takes place is a sort of telling of some reality about Jesus. So it's a pattern that is there. Sometimes he's prophesied. Oh, I don't think that's on. I don't think it's powered. I don't know what's going on. Oh. It come back on, because we can't carry on without it, because we need it for the quiz. So sometimes he's patterned, other times he's prophesied. So we understand, we know there are prophetic scriptures that speak of who this Messiah will be and who Jesus will be and all his. And sometimes he's even present. And we saw last week that he was actually present at creation. Jesus is there at creation. So what we're going to do, so we're going to make our way through the Bible. Now, I could have done it in lots of different ways. I could have taken a theme about Jesus and seen that all through the Old Testament, but I've actually chosen to go through the Old Testament book by book. Okay. Part of that is that as a second focus, if you like, is us understanding the full Bible story, to get the Bible story in our heads and know where things fit, and where different elements of who Jesus is. And of course that does mean that often we might see the same thing about Jesus from a different perspective. We may have seen it patterned and then we might see it prophesied. We may have seen it present and we may have seen it patterned. So there's that opportunity to build our understanding of that. And there's a ministry called Walk Through the Bible. And when you look at your notes, which you can't do yet, and there's a link to their website. And they do lots of fabulous stuff of real Bible study. But they've actually produced a guide on Jesus in the Old Testament. And I've based quite a lot of this on that guide, just as a framework for me to work from. And obviously, there's other things coming in, but it's a really good framework. And I just thought you might like to see the framework. If you can go on to the next slide, Mike. All right, and I've given you a copy of that. You've got a copy of that, so you can see. Look at that. And you can sort of see where we're going, all right? Genesis. So we're in Genesis at the moment. We're going to stay in Genesis this morning. So last time we looked at Jesus as creator in Genesis. But we're going to stay in Genesis. And the word Genesis means beginnings. That actually is what Genesis means. So we're still in the beginnings. Everything that's in Genesis is the beginnings. And what Genesis does is it lays the foundation really for the whole of the rest of the Bible. And we'll see as we look at some of these how much they're laying a foundation, how everything else after Genesis begins to build that up. But it's really good, and so we're going to make our way through that. It's going to take us at least half a year to do the Old Testament stuff, maybe a year, and then we'll get around to the New Testament. So we're going to be looking at Jesus for the next couple of years, okay? Which we're going to be looking at Jesus for the whole of eternity, so that's not a bad move, But last week, obviously, we saw this as creator. The mystery, and we focused quite a lot last week, didn't we, on the mystery of the triune God, the mystery of the Trinity, and how we can't understand it, but the fact that it's a mystery is part of it's meant to be a mystery, so that it captures our imagination and draws us in. But what we did realise is that through knowing that Jesus has been there from the very beginning, but he is with us now, it means that we know God is with us. And so we have the confidence and the faith that Jesus has the authority and the power to accomplish all his purposes for our lives. Now I need to turn this one on. So we're going to have a bit of fun before we get started this morning, because we're going to have a bit of a quiz. We're going to stay in Genesis today. But before we do, I just wanted to, we're actually going to go to Abraham. And so I want to fill in the gap from creation to Abraham. And I thought we'd do it with a bit of a quiz. All right? So if we can have our first question up, Mike. Okay, so our first question is, how many of Adam's children are mentioned by name in the Bible? Anyone like to let me know? How many of Adam's children? Just name any of Adam's children that you think you know. Yeah. Cain and Abel, just two? Yeah. Okay. Interestingly, that's what everyone thinks, but there's another one, isn't there? Yeah. There's actually three that are named. There's Cain and Abel, and then after the loss of Cain, Adam has another child called Seth. And that's quite important. We'll see why in a minute. But what's interesting, that doesn't mean he only had those three children. But it means they're the three we were told about. We're told about the first two because obviously one was, one killed the other. And then obviously Seth, who came to be the other second child. Okay, here's your second question. From which of Adam's sons was Noah descended? Which of those three was Noah descended from? Anybody know?
I think it's Abel.
No?
I'd say Abel.
Seth? Okay, go on. Corinne's right, it's Seth. Which is why it's really important that we remember Seth, because actually it's from Seth that the line comes down. The new son that was born after the shedding of blood, all right, that's born post that terrible time between Cain and Abel, is the one from whom the line now goes down to Noah. Okay, let's go on to the next one. Right. So, does anyone know who Noah's grandfather was?
Adam. No, I don't.
No? Okay, well, let's get his name up.
Jacob. Oh, Methuselah.
It's Methuselah. Anyone heard of Methuselah?
Yeah, I heard the word.
Anyone know what... Right, okay, next question. Does anyone know what Methuselah means?
No.
So Mike's not allowed to answer the questions because he knows the answer to all of these. All right, go on, put up the meaning of Methuselah. Methuselah means when he is dead, it shall be sent. All right?
Wow.
Now, let's look at the generations from... I'm sorry, that's your job, not mine, Joel. I'm just clicking the wrong one. Right. So here we have... I'm going to have to get out the seat, I think, to see it, and because the light's on it. All right, so what you can see here is actually 10 generations from Adam to Noah. All right? What you have is Noah's father was called Lamech, and Lamech's father was Methuselah. Methuselah, the grandfather, died, was actually the son of Enoch. Enoch is the one that walked and was no more. Right. We don't know how, we think Enoch was just taken to heaven, didn't actually die, but we don't know. So there's a lot of prehistory before Noah, which isn't in our Bible, but some of the intertestamental books that were written and Jewish understanding has quite a bit of history about some of this. There's a whole book of, there's the books of Enoch. But in our Bible, we just get told the list. And all of this is in your Bible. If you think I've found this from somewhere else, these years are literally the number of years that each one lived is all listed in Genesis. And what we see is that actually Methuselah died as the flood was sent. In other words, the meaning of his name, when he dies, it will be sent. Even a 1,000 years before the flood, God's purpose was there in the flood. He named Methuselah with the name that would mean, which is why Noah probably did know when the flood was coming, because he knew his grandfather's name. Okay, let's move on from Noah then. And so 10 generations through to Noah. Next question. Right. From which of Noah's sons was Abraham descended? Can you remember the names of Noah's son?
Seth.
No. Noah's sons.
Oh my God.
Ham, Shem and Japheth, all right, were the three sons of Noah that went into the ark with Noah. Ham, Shem and Japheth. So which one do you think Abraham was descended for? If you don't know, we'll just put it up. This was just a bit of fun to make it like that. We remember it better if we do it this way, you see. All right, can you put it up? So he was descended from Shem. All right. And next question, Mike. Last question. How many generations do you think there were from Shem to Abraham? There were 10, remember, from Adam to Noah. How many do you think there were from Shem to Abraham? 10. Well done, Corinne. Corinne's won our quiz this morning.
Well, that was only a guess.
But we know God's got a pattern. Isn't it interesting?
Yeah.
10 from when it all began
It's the numbers, isn't
to
it?
when he had to start, he started again. And another 10 generations through to Abraham. But if you put the next bit up, Mike, there's all the generations. I can give you some copies of this if you want it. All right. So there's the 20 generations through. What is really interesting is that Shem, the father of Abraham, was still alive during the time of Abraham. Most of the rest of those descendants were alive during the time of Abraham.
Wow.
But of course, what we have to understand is the purpose of all those different generations. So let's just recap the storyline. Adam and Eve sin, all right? Man becomes rebellious. They're banished from the garden. You can look at your notes now. I'm on to D, all right? And they're banished from the garden. Sin begins to spread, becomes out of control. So by Genesis 6, man's sin and God's holiness can't coexist.
Yeah.
And the relationship that man was created for has been completely broken down. So by the time we get to Noah, it's all a mess. You know, the generations have multiplied. They've rebelled against God. We've got all sorts of terrible things going on, which we won't take time to go into this morning.
Yeah.
But as a result of that, God sends judgment in the form of the flood. But within that judgment, he has mercy, because our Father is always will show mercy where he can. And he sees Noah, he chooses Noah, and he lets his family start all over again after the flood. And his command to them after the flood is to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. In other words, from these three sons that you have, Noah, they need to multiply, and you need to move out from here. You don't stay here, move out from here and begin to populate the rest of the earth, to take me into the rest of the earth. God's intention was always to create a people who would then multiply and take his glory and his worship across the whole earth. That was the purpose of creating Adam and Eve. Starts again and says to Noah, multiply, fill the earth. But they don't. They actually all remain within the Middle East, very close Middle East region. And so by the time we get to Genesis 11, we're told that man is wanting to make a name for himself. We're on E, Pat.
Yes.
And they think, they think they can build a tower and get to God on their own terms. A Tower of Babel. Are your notes in the right order? Are you okay?
I don't know what.
Front page.
You are front page, don't you?
That's back. Front page, that's back page, isn't it?
Is it? Oh, I'm sorry.
That's fine.
Oh, E.
Okay, I know you like to know where you are, so it's fine. Okay, so what we see then, all right, is that they want to make, they've stayed fairly close with one another. They've all got together. It's become, they think they're getting really powerful because they've got all this number of people, everything's multiplying, they're in charge, they're going to be great, and they're going to build a tower and get to God. The Tower of Babel. God looks down and says, I told you to be fruitful and multiply and get out into the earth, so I'm going to make you do it. I'm going to change all your languages so you can't communicate with one another, and you'll have to go and find your own bit of land where you can operate. And so he spreads, and so it's after the purpose of Babel is to force man to go and do what he's told them to do, all right? To spread out across all the nations. And so that's what they then do, all right? And so we get all the nations, and what we have to understand is all the nations of the earth have descended down from that storyline, from the sons of Noah down across the earth. That's where everyone has come from. And if you think all those different generations, the thousands of people, I mean, they weren't slow in having kids in those days, and they were living hundreds of years. So, there was you can imagine how the population will have grown very dramatically. And when you think the world's population has, doubled in the last 200 years or something, isn't it? Yeah, that's how quickly the world's population can multiply. But one of those groups is the community that stays within the land, stays in the region. And that's that's Abraham. And that's who we're going to focus on this morning. So we're told in Genesis 12. Now the Lord said to Abram, which was his name initially, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonours you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. This is the point at which God decides to make a covenant with one nation, right? With one people. Because he needs to work through one people to impact on the rest of the earth. And so he chooses Abram. And we're told, aren't we, in Scripture, it's because Abraham had faith. Yeah. But he chooses Abraham. And we're going to look at a couple of instances in Abraham's life. Now, I could have looked at more than two. There are more than two pictures of Jesus in Abraham's life. In fact, there are many. And the same will be true of everything that we look at. There will be so much more that we can look at, even if we are going to take all this time. But I've chosen just these two this morning. So we're going to start in Genesis 14. So in Genesis 14, Abraham wins a huge battle when he's pursuing the invading kings who'd taken all his possessions and taken his nephew Lot. So all the people and all his goods they'd captured. And he goes out to battle and he gets it all back. And when he returns, having got it all back, he meets this mysterious priest king who has no clear origin and this highly symbolic name, Melchizedek, king of Salem. Now, Mike looked at this in detail, so I'm not going to look at the detail of the story as such, but we are going to remind ourselves of why this is important. So let's just look at the passage from Genesis 14. So then he, Abraham, brought back all the possessions and also brought back his kinsman, Lot, with his possessions. Lot was his nephew, wasn't he? Yeah. And the women and the people. After his return from the defeat of Chedorlaomer and the kings who were with him, the king of Sodom went out to meet him at the valley of Shaveh. That is the king's valley. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High. And he blessed him and said, blessed be Abram by God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. And Abram gave him a tenth of everything. Now, this is pre the law. This is pre-crucifixion. And here we've got a priest of God Most High bringing bread and wine. And we've got a man giving a tenth of a tithe of everything to this one.
And he's called Melchizedek.
And he's called Melchizedek. And this one that appears is called Melchizedek, king of Salem. Now that's what's really important, because the literal translation of king of Salem is either king of righteousness or king of peace. Shalom. It's all right. So it's it's Melchizedek, king of Salem, and Salem is Shalom. Yeah. So we're told this one is a priest of God Most High. He's identified as a king, but he's a king priest. He brings out wine. He blesses Abraham, and then he receives from Abraham this tithe offering. Now we have to, as post-resurrection Christians, to go, that's interesting. What on earth is that showing us? We should never just skim over these things and go, well, that's interesting, I haven't got a clue what that is. We need to ask God, what are you showing us? It wouldn't be in there if it wasn't there to say something to us. But what is really interesting is that Melchizedek then disappears from the scene. He never appears again in the Hebrew scriptures in the Old Testament, except in reference to this event. In the New Testament, he's only referred to in reference to this event. And in Hebrews 11, the writer actually is the one that gives us insight into the significance of this event. So this is why if I say, if you want to look at this in more detail, go back to Mike's notes on Hebrews 11, okay? Hebrews 11 was written because in the early church, believers began to identify Jesus as their high priest with revelation from the scriptures. But the Jewish Christians objected to that because how could Jesus be a priest if he wasn't even a Levite? All right, because to the Jewish mindset, priests have to come from the line of Levi. It's Mosaic in its origin. Well, the point is there's a reference to priest long before Levi. There's this reference to Melchizedek. And so the writer of the Hebrews actually draws attention to a psalm that is written about the Messiah in which the connection is made. So we need to look at Psalm 110 because that is really significant. Now there's only 2 psalms that are actually written that are David's revelation of something that's actually going on in heaven. Go on. Yeah.
It's actually Hebrews 7.
Oh, sorry, Hebrews 7, sorry. I don't know how I got that wrong. Sorry, thank you. You want to correct that. But can we have the next reference up, darling? Psalm 110. So the Lord says to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool. So this is God the Father says to God, Jesus the Son, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. The Lord sends forth from Zion your mighty scepter. Rule in the midst of your enemies. Your people will offer themselves freely on the day of your power in holy garments. From the womb of the morning, the dew of your youth will be yours. The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. David understood that Jesus had been a priest forever of a different order, the order of Melchizedek. And so in Hebrews 7, it's right here, the reference is right. Another priest, we're told, this is what we're told by the writer of Hebrews, another priest arises in the likeness of Melchizedek, who has become a priest, not on the basis of a legal requirement concerning bodily descent, in other words, not as a Levite, but by the power of an indestructible life, by the fact that he has been raised again and is seated in heaven. For it is witnessed of him, you are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. That's the quote from Psalm 2. So what we see from these passages that Melchizedek appeared centuries before the law at Sinai, which gave us the Levitical priesthood. And he enters that scene without a beginning or an end, just like Jesus did. He seemed to be a man, but also something more. He was just like Jesus, because that's what Hebrews 7 tells us. He's of, a priest arises in the likeness of Melchizedek. He came with a meal of bread and wine, just like Jesus. He received an offering and offered a blessing, just like Jesus. And we can see here was symbolic of an everlasting priesthood that would never end. Apart from the law of Moses, it's not part of the Mosaic law. This is pre-creation established priesthood. What this shows us is that Jesus is of that priesthood. He's of the priesthood of Melchizedek. The King of righteousness and the Prince of peace. The King of Salem, Melchizedek, is a startling portrait of who the Messiah would be, who was to come. Now, it's difficult to know both the story of Melchizedek and the story of Jesus and not associate the two, as we did this morning when we just looked at those verses. And in fact, many people actually believe that Melchizedek was actually a vision of the pre-incarnate Christ. We don't know whether Melchizedek was a presentation, was actually Jesus present. So this story could be both a pattern and Jesus present. We don't know that. Or whether this was a priest of the same order who came from heaven as a king, but certainly what we see is the nature of priesthood according to the order of Melchizedek is both king and priest. It has rulership authority and ministering within it. And we are told that we are kings and priests, or a kingdom of priests. We are of that order. But at the very least, we can say that centuries before Jesus came, God gave us a picture of his ministry in this incident from the life of Abraham, who had just recovered what was stolen by thieves. And Jesus promises to restore all that has been lost, and he intercedes for us as a priest. The Levitical priesthood, which was patterned on the heavenly priesthood of Melchizedek, has now been replaced by the order of Melchizedek, with Jesus our high priest. See, what we need to understand is the Levitical priesthood, and we'll see this when we come to start looking at all the Levitical elements as we get into Moses and Leviticus and those areas. As we get into that, we'll begin to see that actually what Moses was given as a pattern for the temple and the priesthood was actually what he had seen in heaven. That exists in heaven, but it's not a Levitical priesthood. It's a priesthood according to the order of Melchizedek. And Jesus is a priest. Why is Jesus a priest? Because what a priest does is he stands between God and the people. Intercession is about coming before God for the people and before the people for God. That's exactly what Jesus did. Some of you will know from the intro course, when I talk about Jesus as our intercessor, I do this because actually Jesus was the greatest intercessor there ever was. He went on a cross so he could bring God into connection with people and people into connection with God. That is the nature of priesthood. Our intercession in the prayer room is about coming before God for the people, and the other part of our intercession is actually to show God to the people. To be an intercessor isn't only to pray, it's to live as one who demonstrates God to the people. That's the nature of priesthood and the nature of intercession. So what we see in Hebrews 7 again, in verses 23 to 27, the writer of Hebrews makes this very clear. The former priests were many in number because they were prevented by death from continuing in office. So the high priest was continually replaced as someone died. But he, that's Jesus, holds his priesthood permanently because he continues forever. Consequently, and this is why this all matters, he is able to save to the uttermost those who draw near to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. The way that heaven is set up, the way that God's kingdom is set up, is that there is a priesthood through which the people can come in to relation. It's a bit like, if you think of a royal court, right, because that's what it is a royal court. Yeah. Yeah. Think of a royal court, to come and see if we want to go and see the Queen, we have to do that through the people who have the authority to take us in there. You can't just go up to Buckingham Palace, knock on the door, say, "Can I see the Queen, please?" All right. You have to be escorted into her presence. I mean, even the Prime Minister on his weekly meetings with her is brought into the room. He doesn't just walk in, he's brought into the room by one of her people, part of her court. That's what it's called. They're called her courtiers. And so those who are present in the court can bring us in. Jesus has that position. He brings us into relationship with the Father. As our high priest, that is his responsibility. The point is that one priest who goes between us and God and makes right with God and prays for us to God is not just some ordinary, weak, sinful, dying priest like it was in the Levitical, which is why it was never going to accomplish fully what God wanted. He's the Son of God. He's strong, he's sinless, and he has an indestructible life. And he's not ministering in that earthly tabernacle like the Levites did. No matter how glorious the temple might have eventually looked, Christ's actually ministering for us in a true tabernacle, which the Lord has pitched. He's in heaven with the Father. Our high priest is seated at the right hand of the Majesty in heaven. No Old Testament priest could ever say that. Jesus deals directly with God the Father. And so the picture of Melchizedek is a one of those pictures that gives us an insight into the nature of Jesus' priesthood. It helps us see those links are there deliberately so that we go, hang on, there's a link between Melchizedek and Jesus. He is a priest. And if we understand priesthood, and that's something that the church on the whole does not understand priesthood, and we need to get a greater revelation of priesthood. But he is the one there. The revelation of Jesus, our high priest, actually invites us into our eternal relationship with the Godhead through the Son. As our high priest, Jesus alone can make atonement for our sin and brings us to God. And so this was the plan from the very beginning, and it's revealed in Genesis 14, initially through Melchizedek. That's where we first see that that concept, if you like, of priesthood. And we first see that element of who Jesus is. He's our high priest. Of course, every time we look at each of these, we see another facet of who Jesus is. That's what should fascinate us and draw us into Jesus. So that's Genesis 14. Jesus is our high priest, interceding for us, opening up the way for us to come into relationship with God. We're just going to look at another event in Abraham's life now. So that's very early in Abraham's life. A lot of other things happen. And then in Genesis 22, afterwards, we see this story around Isaac. So as part of the covenant that God made with Abraham, we all know, I think, that he promises him a son. And from that son, many descendants who will fill the earth. So here we see now not just all those other nations that have gone out after the Tower of Babel, but what we see now is this family that's going to become a nation that will spread out across the earth to make God known. But as we also know, that promised son is very, very late in coming, and as a result leads to Abraham and Sarah getting up to all sorts of things they shouldn't, but we won't look at that this morning. You know, read through Genesis, it's a really good storybook. But it's not until they're in their old age they have this miracle son called Isaac. But then in Genesis 22, we read this. So this is the miracle son that God has promised, that they've waited into their old age. 80, Abraham was, I think, when they had Isaac. In Genesis 22. 100. Yes, that's right. It was 8 this. Genesis 22, we read this. After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham. And he said, here am I. And he said, take your son, your only son, Isaac. Now, interesting, he wasn't his only son, but it was the only son that was born as God had intended, and the only son that was the promised son, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. Now, why did God do that? I mean, you know, a lot of people will ask that. They say, oh, well, that just shows you he's a really horrible God. You know, he doesn't care. He promises you something, then he takes it away. Well, because he didn't take it away. That's the whole point. Because what we have here is God setting up another storyline to help us see more, to foreshadow another pattern of Jesus. I mean, we have to recognise it must have been an excruciating experience, not just for Abraham, but also for Isaac. Isaac was a young man. He wasn't a boy. He was a young man at this point. I think often we think, oh, he's just a little boy that, you know, 3-year-old, pick him up. But no, he was a young man. And so it must have been really difficult for Abraham as he accepted the situation. And then Isaac, as he knows what's happening. You know, I mean, you can't hide what you're about to do, you know. The point is that this experience is full of faith. It talks about faith.
That was what it was all about.
And that's why Abraham is called, who's chosen as a man of faith.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because we can see that Abraham has faith from the very beginning of this whole event, because he says to his servants, we will come back to you. Abraham knew that God had a way. He didn't know what the way was, but he knew God had a way. Was he going to bring Isaac back to life? Maybe. Then when Isaac notices the wood and fire but asks where the sacrifice is, his father replies that God will provide. And as the story unfolds, we know God does provide. He dramatically stops Abraham, turns his attention to a ram caught by his horns in the thicket, and Abraham's willing to offer his greatest treasure, his son. And that willingness was what God was looking for. But you see, it's hard not to notice the parallels between Abraham offering his son, and centuries later, God offering his son on the same mountain. Because Moriah is Jerusalem, and the crucifixion was on Mount Moriah, the same place. So here's the parallels. Isaac was led up the mountain and bound like a lamb to the slaughter. Now, it's interesting because Jesus was put on the cross. We don't know. We talk about him being bound like a lamb to the slaughter, but that is actually that's prefigured, and that's actually taking language from what happened with Abraham and Isaac. A multitude of descendants would come from this son, but only after his father gave him up. It's the same with Jesus.
Yeah.
The Christian faith has spread across the whole world. It's come from a sacrifice, that was made. And even though Abraham was willing to sacrifice his son, he expected to receive him back by resurrection. Now, Hebrews tells us that. So did God in his sacrifice of Jesus. He allowed the sacrifice to be made because he knew he would be able to raise him again. And as I said, Mount Moriah is considered to be the site where Jesus was crucified. It's also the site of Solomon's temple. So in this story, God painted a startling preview of the cross nearly 2 millennia later. Not only does Isaac represent Jesus in this story, but so does the ram. The ram, interestingly, caught by his head in a thicket. Why bother to tell us that the ram was caught up in thorns?
In the head.
What did Jesus have on his head? A crown of thorns.
Yeah, and he was called the lamb, wasn't he?
Yeah, and you see, all of this is so. Why did God do all this? So the Jewish people, when Jesus came, would recognise who he was. But they got so into their own up their own ideas.
Well, they had all those laws.
Yeah, they remained in the Mosaic, in that Mosaic law, and had expanded it so that they put their trust in the law, not in God, and so they didn't see what God was doing. Unlike other ancient stories of gods and sacrifice, this one shows us a God who not only demands the sacrifice, which he does, but he also provides it. He issues the requirements and then he proceeds to satisfy them. So he says, go and sacrifice this, and he says, I'll give you the sacrifice. The only response he asks for from Abraham is faith. God completes the assignment himself. But God didn't go, oh, don't worry about that, I can do this. He actually expected Abraham to have faith. The same is true for us. There is a sacrifice. He has done everything, but we have to have faith in that. We have to walk that out. It's a beautiful picture of the gospel. Our sin put us in a position of paying excruciating cost. God provided a sacrifice so the cost would be on his shoulders rather than ours. But we still have to climb that mountain. We have to climb the mountain in obedience. Yeah. But we'll find him there with a provision that accomplishes righteousness on our behalf. God actually did what Abraham was asked and then excused from doing. And in the same way, he gave us his son. Through requiring Abraham to sacrifice his precious son, and then supplying a substitute, God gave us a remarkable sneak peek of the cross. And Peter tells us this. For you know that God paid a ransom to save you from the empty life you inherited from your ancestors. And it wasn't paid with mere gold or silver, which lose their value. It was the precious blood of Christ, the sinless, spotless Lamb of God. God chose him as your ransom long before the world began. But now in these last days, he has been revealed for our sake. Long before the world began, Jesus was a high priest. Long before the world began, Jesus was chosen as the sacrifice. And so in Genesis, we see those things prefigured because they already exist. They don't come into existence in the New Testament. They already exist. Not only is Jesus already there as creator, he's already there as high priest, he's already there as our sacrifice. So both of these events from Abraham's life show us how God was preparing his people for the revealing of his son in human flesh. And we're only in the first book of the Bible. And already we've seen his divinity, his priesthood, and that he is the sacrifice. How could we not see that God has been writing his divine storyline from the beginning of time? We were created for relationship with the Godhead, and we have to do nothing but recognise Jesus for who he is and submit to his leadership. He'll provide all we need as our creator and sustainer. Everything we need, he can bring into being. As our sacrifice that opens up the way and that pays the price. And he can bring us into relationship by his high priestly role of intercession. So I just have a little question for you to finish. This isn't a quiz, this is a question to take with you. How does the revelation of Jesus as high priest and sacrifice impact on our faith and your faith and your life with Christ? I think there is time this week to sit before the Lord and meditate on him as our high priest and as the sacrifice. What does that actually mean? How does that change our relationship with him? What does it mean about the way we live out our Christian life? Because every aspect of who Jesus is should impact on us. This is not just, this is a clever little mystery that we're unravelling. What does it mean that he's high priest? How does that change your life? That he is your high priest, that he is the mediator between us and God. How does the fact that he's the sacrifice, but like Abraham, we have to have the faith to go up the mountain and receive that sacrifice? What does that mean in our lives? Maybe take a bit of time this week to think about that before we stay in Genesis yet again when we come back. It's Mike for the next couple of weeks. When we come back to this series, in a few weeks' time, we'll still be in Genesis. Because there's still a lot more, because Genesis is the beginnings. So there's quite a lot of revelation in Genesis that builds the storyline. And I would really say, read Genesis as if you want a novel for this week. Well, it's not a novel because it's not non-fiction. It's non-fiction. It's non-fiction. It's not fiction. But pick up something like the New Living Bible, something that writes it in a very easy way, and just read through Genesis and get the storyline, because the wonder of what God does as he unfolds these different aspects of who he is and what he's doing. It's phenomenal.